I steered my boat through choppy waters toward the dark outline of an island locals called the Prison. For weeks, the fishermen in Port Louis had tried to warn me away from it. They'd cross themselves whenever I mentioned it, muttering about curses in Creole they didn't think I understood. One old man had grabbed my wrist with fingers twisted from decades of pulling nets, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "That place eats people," he'd said in broken English. "It takes them down." But I felt an odd pull I couldn't explain. After 20 years of deep-sea exploration, I'd learned to trust my gut. Whatever waited on that island or beneath its waters called to me on some frequency I couldn't name or ignore. My advanced diving suit lay ready in the boat's cabin. The experimental rebreather system represented cutting-edge technology, designed for extended underwater work without the need to surface. My former colleagues at the Oceanographic Institute would kill to get their hands on it, but I'd earned exclusive testing rights through years of building relationships with the developers. The system could keep me submerged for 6 hours, more than enough time to begin mapping whatever lay beneath these waters. The island's jagged coastline came into view as afternoon sun cast long shadows across its barren surface. No vegetation grew here, just black rock jutting from the Indian Ocean like broken teeth. The volcanic formation shouldn't have looked different from dozens of others I'd visited throughout my career, yet something about its silhouette against the sky made my stomach knot. I anchored my boat in a protected cove where the water remained relatively calm despite the chop farther out. The anchor chain rattled as it descended, the sound too loud against the strange quiet that seemed to envelop the island. I pulled out my binoculars to study the shoreline, adjusting the focus as I scanned the perimeter. Strange sounds carried on the wind. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that made my skin crawl. I'd heard similar noises in underwater caves before, usually just water moving through rock formations. That's what I told myself as I lowered the binoculars, but the explanation felt hollow even to me. The remains of stone structures dotted the island's interior, their purpose unclear from this distance. They looked ancient, their edges softened by time and weather. Not modern ruins, but something far older. Through the binoculars, I could make out what might have been walls, columns, maybe even a temple of some kind. The structures showed surprising symmetry, suggesting whoever built them possessed advanced architectural knowledge. I made notes in my waterproof journal, sketching what I could see from my position. The scientific part of my brain cataloged possibilities: an abandoned colonial outpost, a religious site, maybe even pre-colonial indigenous structures. But none of these explanations felt right. The island's construction seemed wrong somehow, like looking at optical illusions that defied natural laws. As evening approached, I prepared my equipment for tomorrow's dive. I checked the rebreather system twice, testing oxygen flow and scrubber function. My underwater lights received fresh batteries, and I calibrated my depth gauge. The work was routine, keeping my hands busy while my mind tried to process the unease seeping into my thoughts. Something about this place felt familiar, though I'd never been here before. The sensation wasn't déjà vu exactly, more like recognizing a place I'd seen in dreams. The thought made me pause while loading film into my underwater camera. Dreams had led me to significant discoveries before. During my doctoral research, I dreamt of a specific cave formation 3 nights in a row, then found an identical structure containing a new species of blind crab. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on my small camping stove. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and reds that reflected off the dark water. In the fading light, the island's silhouette seemed to shift and change, as if the rock itself moved when I wasn't looking directly at it. I told myself it was just tricks of the light, the same way ocean depths play with perception when diving without proper reference points. But the rational explanation didn't stop me from glancing repeatedly at the shoreline as darkness fell. The night grew darker than it should have, considering the clear sky filled with stars. It was as if the island absorbed light rather than reflected it. I switched on my boat's small cabin lights and continued organizing my gear for tomorrow's early start. The wind shifted, bringing more of those strange sounds across the water. In the dark, they seemed more distinct, almost like whispers in a language just beyond my understanding. I caught myself straining to listen, as if I might suddenly comprehend what was being said. I shook my head and focused on my equipment again. Tomorrow, I would see what lay beneath these waters. Tomorrow, I would learn what called me to this forbidden place. I just hoped the fisherman's warnings were simply the product of generations of superstition rather than hard-earned wisdom. I woke well before sunrise, shaking off a night of restless sleep filled with half-remembered dreams of dark water and stone. The strange sounds from the island had continued intermittently throughout the night, making it hard to stay asleep for long. I sat up in my small cabin, listening to water lapping against the hull while checking the time. 4:30 in the morning. Perfect. The experimental rebreather system waited for me, along with the rest of my gear carefully laid out the night before. I moved through my pre-dive routine with practiced efficiency, the familiar actions grounding me after the unsettling night. Each piece of equipment underwent a final check as I assembled my kit. Just another dive, I told myself, though we both knew I was lying. Outside, the eastern sky showed the first hints of brightening as I pulled on my wetsuit. The neoprene felt snug and reassuring against my skin, a second layer of protection between me and whatever waited below. I strapped on my weights, adjusted my buoyancy compensator, and double-checked my underwater camera. The island loomed dark and silent as dawn approached. In the growing light, I could make out more details of its barren surface, the jagged black rock rising from the water like a warning. The strange structures I'd spotted yesterday stood in stark relief against the lightening sky, their symmetry even more apparent now. I secured my boat one last time, making sure everything was locked down in case weather turned while I was below. The anchor held firm, and my emergency beacon was set to activate if I didn't return to disable it within 8 hours. Standard procedure when diving alone, though I usually avoided solo dives. This place, however, demanded a first look without distractions. The water around the boat appeared unusually clear as I prepared to enter. I could see much deeper than expected, especially considering the choppy conditions farther from shore. I tested the water temperature with my hand, cool but manageable with my wetsuit. My dive computer confirmed 26 degrees Celsius. I fitted my mask, inserted my mouthpiece, and did a final systems check on the rebreather. Green lights across the board. Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the boat and slipped beneath the surface with barely a splash. The first thing that struck me was the visibility, exceptional, almost unnaturally so. Sunlight penetrated the water with unusual clarity, illuminating the underwater landscape around me. I kicked downward, following the island's rocky base, and immediately noticed something odd. The seafloor didn't gradually slope away as it should. Instead, it dropped off dramatically into what appeared to be an impossibly deep trench surrounding the entire island. I swam along the edge of this drop-off, adjusting my buoyancy to maintain a steady 20 feet below the surface. At this depth, I spotted the first evidence that this place held more than natural wonders. Stone blocks, massive, perfectly cut rectangles of dark stone, protruded from the island's underwater base. These weren't random rocks or natural formations. Their edges were too sharp, too precise, the angles too perfect. I ran my gloved hand along one surface, feeling the smooth texture that only came from expert stonework. These blocks appeared to form part of a foundation or outer wall that extended downward into the darkness. I switched on my underwater lights for a better look, sweeping the beam across the stone surface. What I saw made me stop and hover in place. Intricate carvings covered portions of the blocks, worn by time and water, but still visible. They reminded me of Mesopotamian cuneiform, but with flowing, curved elements more similar to Polynesian designs. I'd never seen anything quite like them in 20 years of marine archaeology. I took several photographs, making sure to capture close-ups of the symbols with scale markers in frame. The evidence of human craftsmanship at this depth raised countless questions. Historical records showed no known civilization in this region capable of such underwater construction. Following the wall downward, I descended gradually, watching my depth gauge tick upward. 30 feet, 40 feet. The wall continued unbroken, curving slightly as if following the perimeter of something massive below. At 50 feet, the wall ended abruptly in what appeared to be a wide opening, an entrance of some kind. I paused there, playing my lights across the darkness beyond the threshold. What I saw made me forget all scientific detachment. Beyond the opening lay structures, buildings, stretching away into the gloom. Not natural formations, but constructed architecture on a scale that defied belief. I checked my depth gauge again, 60 feet, and swam forward through the entrance. I found myself hovering above what could only be described as a submerged city. Massive stone buildings rose from the seafloor, some standing 30 or 40 feet tall even at this depth. Streets and passages wound between them in planned patterns. Plazas opened up in what must have been public spaces. The architecture followed no style I recognized from my studies. The buildings had a strange, almost organic quality, despite being made of stone, with curved walls that flowed into arched doorways and windows without clear delineations. I swam down one of the wider avenues, lights illuminating structures on either side. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every surface featured carvings, some decorative, others clearly telling stories I couldn't yet interpret. Figures that might have been human mixed with images of marine life and geometric patterns in panels that wrapped around entire buildings. The symbols I'd seen on the outer wall appeared here too, more elaborate and numerous. They decorated doorways, window frames, and what looked like public monuments. Their meaning remained obscure, though they had a systematic appearance suggesting a fully developed writing system rather than mere decoration. Swimming between two tall structures, I emerged into what must have been the city's central plaza. The space was enormous, with several massive buildings arranged around its perimeter. I paused to take more photographs, trying to capture the scale and detail of what lay before me. Something felt wrong about the space. The city extended far beyond what should have been possible given the size of the island above. Its boundaries disappeared into darkness in all directions, suggesting a metropolitan area many times larger than the visible portion of the island. The mathematical impossibility of this struck me as I hovered there, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be physically possible. The absence of marine life added to the strangeness. No fish swam among the buildings. No crustaceans scuttled along the stone surfaces. Not even the smallest polyps or anemones had colonized these structures. The city existed in complete biological isolation, preserved as if sealed away from the normal processes of marine colonization. The only sound came from my breathing apparatus, a rhythmic hiss that seemed too loud in the absolute silence. No currents moved through the streets and passages. The water remained unnaturally still, as if the entire city existed in some pocket of space separate from the ocean around it. I swam toward one of the largest structures bordering the plaza, a building with a grand entrance flanked by columns unlike any architectural style I recognized. The columns twisted upward in spirals, decorated with those same strange symbols. I moved closer, shining my light on the entrance. The doorway stood open, revealing darkness beyond. I hesitated there, photographing the entrance in detail. My training and experience urged caution. Entering unknown submerged structures always carried risks of collapse or entrapment, but my curiosity pushed harder. This discovery represented something unprecedented in archaeological history. I checked my air supply and dive time. The rebreather system showed normal operation with hours of capacity remaining. My depth gauge read 70 feet, well within safe limits. After confirming all systems remained green, I swam through the entrance. Inside, my lights revealed a vast chamber with a high ceiling, supported by more of those spiral columns. The walls featured elaborate relief carvings showing scenes I struggled to interpret, figures that might have been human engaged in activities around stylized depictions of the ocean and what appeared to be the island itself. As I moved deeper into the building, the carvings changed in theme, becoming increasingly focused on a single subject, a large entity shown always in connection with water. The depictions started simply, with small representations, but grew more elaborate and central in the narrative as I followed them along the walls. I documented everything meticulously with my camera, knowing that without visual evidence, no one would believe what I'd found. The implications were staggering: a completely unknown civilization with advanced architectural capabilities existing in a location with no historical record of settlement. The deeper I ventured into the city, the more a sense of wrongness grew within me. Something about the proportions of the buildings, the angles of the streets, the patterns of the symbols, they all seemed slightly off, as if designed according to mathematical principles different from those used in any known human architecture. I found myself repeatedly checking over my shoulder, feeling as if I were being watched despite the obvious abandonment of the city. The complete silence, broken only by my breathing, began to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. At one point, I turned quickly, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, but my lights revealed only empty water and stone. I told myself it was just shadows created by my moving lights, but the explanation felt hollow. The same unease I'd felt on the boat returned stronger now, a sense that I didn't belong here, that nothing living belonged here. I made my way back toward the central plaza, intending to continue my survey of the outer regions of the city. The rational part of my mind worked to categorize what I was seeing, to fit it into known archaeological frameworks, but none seemed adequate. This place defied conventional explanation. As I swam across the plaza, I noticed something I'd missed during my initial observation: a structure at its very center, half buried in silt. Unlike the other buildings, this one was circular, with what appeared to be a domed roof, partially collapsed. Something about its placement and design suggested importance, perhaps a temple or civic center. I adjusted my course to investigate this central structure, noting that the symbols carved around its visible entrance appeared larger and more elaborate than those I'd seen elsewhere. This building clearly held special significance in the city's hierarchy. My unease continued to grow as I approached. The water seemed to thicken around me, becoming harder to move through despite the lack of current. I checked my equipment again, wondering if something might be malfunctioning, but all indicators remained normal. Swimming through the half-buried entrance, I found myself in a circular chamber with walls covered in the most detailed carvings I'd seen yet. My lights caught glints of something embedded in the stone, not just carvings, but inlays of material that might have been metal or some kind of mineral, creating patterns that seemed to shift as my light moved across them. The chamber appeared to be some kind of important civic or religious space. A raised platform dominated the center with what might have been an altar or ceremonial table. Around this central feature, the floor featured concentric circles of those strange symbols, radiating outward to the walls. I took more photographs, focusing on capturing the full sequence of images that wrapped around the chamber walls. These appeared to tell a coherent narrative, though its meaning remained obscure to me. The figures became more stylized and less human-like in these depictions, with elements that reminded me of marine creatures integrated into their forms. The silence pressed in on me as I worked. Even the sound of my breathing seemed muffled now, as if the water itself absorbed sound rather than transmitting it. I found myself working faster, driven by a growing desire to complete my documentation and return to the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an intruder here, that my presence disturbed something long at rest. The fishermen's warnings echoed in my mind, their fear suddenly seeming less like superstition and more like hard-earned wisdom. After completing my survey of the central chamber, I checked my dive time. I'd been underwater for nearly 2 hours already, though the advanced rebreather system meant I still had plenty of air. Still, the growing sense of wrongness made me decide to begin my return journey, planning to come back for more detailed exploration once I'd had time to process what I'd found. I swam back through the city streets toward the entrance where I'd first discovered the submerged metropolis. The buildings loomed around me, their strange architecture seeming more alien than ever. I couldn't escape the thought that they watched me leave, their empty windows like eyes tracking my movement. The scale of my discovery weighed on me as I began my ascent. This city represented a chapter of human history previously unknown, or perhaps something else entirely. Its construction defied explanation, its preservation underwater equally baffling. The lack of marine life colonization alone represented a scientific anomaly worth years of study. As I reached the wall marking the city's boundary and began my final ascent, I looked back one last time at the submerged metropolis. In the fading reach of my lights, the buildings stood silent and eternal, their secrets barely touched by my brief exploration. I knew I would return. The mystery of this place had hooked itself into my mind too deeply to ignore. The sunlight grew stronger as I ascended, the blue of the ocean above me a welcome sight after the darkness below. Yet even as I neared the surface, that sense of wrongness, of being watched, remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that my discovery of the city had changed something, awakened something that had been better left undisturbed. I swam back toward the central plaza, intending to examine the structure I'd noticed earlier at its center. My scientific mind was racing, trying to categorize and contextualize this underwater city that defied all historical records. The circular building, half buried in silt, drew me like a magnet. Unlike the other structures with their strange organic curves and angles, this one stood out with its perfect symmetry and central placement. As I approached, I saw that what I had initially taken for a collapsed dome was actually an intricate series of concentric rings, stepping inward and upward to create a pyramid-like effect. The entire structure seemed designed to focus attention on its center, like an astronomical observatory or ritual space. When I reached the entrance, I stopped cold. Flanking the massive doorway stood stone guardians, unlike anything I'd ever encountered in 2 decades of archaeological work. They were statues, clearly, but carved with such detail that for an unsettling moment I thought they might be actual creatures frozen in stone. Each stood about 12 feet tall, with bodies that began human-like at the torso but transformed into something else entirely below and above. Where arms should have been, writhing tentacles extended outward, carved with such skill that they seemed to move in the gentle current of my passing. Their faces combined human features with cephalopod characteristics, eyes too large and round, mouths surrounded by smaller tentacles instead of lips. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every sucker and fold of flesh rendered in perfect detail. I took several photographs, making sure to capture the statues from multiple angles. My camera flash illuminated details I hadn't initially noticed, symbols carved into their stone flesh that matched the writing system I'd seen throughout the city. These weren't merely decorative guardians, they carried meaning, perhaps representing the entity depicted in the symbols I'd seen repeated throughout the city. I swam between them into the temple interior, my lights cutting through water that seemed unusually dark despite the structure's open design. Inside, the circular chamber expanded well beyond what the exterior dimensions suggested possible. I checked my compass, trying to orient myself, but the needle spun uselessly. Something about this place interfered with basic navigation tools. The walls of the chamber rose in a perfect circle, curving upward to that stepped ceiling I'd observed from outside. What I hadn't been able to see from the exterior was that each of those concentric rings contained its own set of carvings, telling a story that spiraled from the floor to the center of the ceiling. I began at what seemed to be the logical starting point, panels near the entrance that showed scenes of ordinary life. My lights revealed images of a civilization at its peak. The carvings depicted people with slightly elongated limbs going about daily activities, fishing, building, performing rituals. Their city, recognizable as the one I now explored, was shown thriving above water rather than submerged. I followed the narrative, swimming slowly along the wall while photographing each panel in sequence. The carvings showed the city's growth and prosperity, with increasingly elaborate buildings and communal gathering spaces. Technology appeared advanced for what must have been an ancient civilization, with images of machines or devices I couldn't identify. As I moved deeper into the temple, the carving's subject matter shifted. The people were now shown looking toward the ocean, arms outstretched in poses of supplication or worship. The next panels revealed what they worshipped, a massive entity emerging from the depths. I hovered before these panels, studying them carefully. The creature depicted had a body like nothing found in any biological classification system. It combined elements of cephalopods with features that seemed almost cetacean, yet was clearly neither. Numerous tentacles extended from a central mass, while multiple eyes ringed what might have been a head. Its scale in the carvings dwarfed the human figures, suggesting something of Leviathan proportions. I traced my gloved fingers over these images, noting the incredible detail. The carvers had managed to convey both the physical form of the entity and a sense of its power. The human figures in these scenes showed clear reverence, offering sacrifices, initially food and crafted objects, later what appeared to be living sacrifices. The narrative continued around the chamber, showing the entity bestowing gifts upon the civilization: knowledge, abundant harvests from the sea, protection from storms. The people prospered further, their buildings growing more elaborate, incorporating design elements that mimicked the creature's tentacular form. I swam higher, following the story as it spiraled upward. My camera clicked continuously as I documented each panel. This was unprecedented, a complete historical record of an unknown civilization and its religious practices, preserved in perfect condition. Then the narrative darkened. The panels began showing changes in the entity's behavior. Where earlier carvings showed it benevolently rising from the depths to accept offerings, newer images depicted it demanding more. The sacrifices increased in frequency and scale. The people's expressions, once joyful in their worship, now showed fear. I moved to the next sequence and felt a chill despite my wetsuit. The carvings showed the entity partially emerging from the water, tentacles reaching into the city itself to take what it wanted. Human figures fled in terror from these scenes. The civilization's leaders were shown gathering in this very temple, based on the distinctive circular architecture depicted. They appeared to be planning something, consulting scrolls and creating complex circular patterns identical to those I now saw carved into the floor beneath me. The next panel showed a ritual of immense scale. Hundreds of people formed concentric circles around the temple, while inside, the leaders performed some kind of ceremony. The entity was shown raging in the water offshore, tentacles lashing out as if sensing a threat. I continued following the narrative upward, my lights revealing the final chapter of this civilization's history. The leaders had apparently decided to imprison the very god they once worshipped, using symbols and rituals that covered the creature in chains of light. The carved panels showed it being drawn downward, beneath the island itself, into some kind of chamber or prison. The final sequence of panels, spiraling toward the center of the ceiling, showed the entity's rage. Its tentacles burst through the city streets, wrapping around buildings and people alike. The carvings depicted screaming figures being dragged into the depths. The last panel, at the very center of the ceiling, showed the city half submerged, the entity partially bound beneath it, a single massive eye open and watching. I hovered directly beneath this final image, my lights illuminating details that made my skin crawl despite years of scientific detachment. The carvers had somehow managed to convey malevolence and patient rage in that single eye. It stared down at me, as if aware of my presence across the centuries. I took multiple photographs of this final panel, making sure to capture every detail. Whatever I discovered here went beyond archaeology. This was a historical account of something that defied conventional understanding. If these carvings were to be believed, This civilization had imprisoned something beneath this island, something they once worshipped but grew to fear. My scientific mind raced to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps this was merely mythology, the story a culture told itself to explain natural disasters or its own decline. The submerged state of the city could be explained by rising sea levels or geological subsidence. The entity might simply represent natural forces beyond their control, personified as a god that turned against them. Yet the precision of the carvings, the consistency of the narrative, and the evident care taken to preserve this record suggested the people who created it believed every detail to be literal truth. I continued taking photographs, moving systematically to ensure I captured the entire narrative sequence. The implications were staggering from an archaeological perspective. This could rewrite our understanding of pre-colonial civilizations in this region, if not human history itself. As I worked, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had followed me since entering the city. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the sound of my breathing and the occasional click of my camera. The water remained unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. I turned to photograph the opposite wall, and something moved at the edge of my vision, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. I spun around, my lights cutting through the water, but found only empty space and carved stone. The temple remained as silent and abandoned as before. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks after hours of studying disturbing imagery. Underwater perception was always tricky, with shadows and reflections behaving differently than they did on land. Still, I found myself working faster, wanting to complete my documentation. I checked my depth gauge and dive time. I'd been underwater for 3 hours already. The experimental rebreather was performing flawlessly, but my own mental fatigue was becoming a factor. Extended time at depth could impair judgment, and I needed to remain sharp. I swam in a complete circle, making sure I hadn't missed any sections of the narrative. The temple's design made more sense now that I understood its purpose. Not just a place of worship, but a historical record, and, if the carvings were to be believed, the focal point of whatever ritual had been used to bind the entity. The circular patterns on the floor that I'd noticed upon entering now took on new significance. They matched exactly the binding symbols shown in the carvings. I hovered over them, photographing their intricate design. Some contained the writing system I'd seen throughout the city, while others formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to spiral inward toward the center of the chamber. As I moved toward that center point, the water felt different, denser somehow, though my equipment registered no change in pressure or composition. I pushed forward, determined to document everything before ending my dive. In the exact center of the chamber, directly beneath the carved eye on the ceiling, stood a raised platform. Unlike the stone used throughout the rest of the city, this appeared to be made of some black material that absorbed rather than reflected my light. I had to adjust my camera settings to capture it properly. The platform was circular, about 6 feet in diameter, with a slight depression in its center. The edges were carved with more of those strange symbols, forming a continuous band around its circumference. I took close-up photographs of these, noting their similarity to the binding symbols in the narrative panels. When I touched the platform's surface, I pulled my hand back immediately. Despite being underwater for what must have been centuries, the material felt warm. This made no scientific sense. Nothing at this depth should retain heat without a source. I checked my glove for damage, finding none, then cautiously touched the surface again. The warmth remained, along with something else. A subtle vibration, as if the material contained energy waiting to be released. I took samples from the edge, where a small piece had broken away, securing it in one of my specimen containers. Whatever this material was, it wasn't stone as I understood it. As I sealed the container, something moved again in my peripheral vision. Closer this time, a definite presence rather than just a shadow. I turned quickly, my lights sweeping across the temple interior, but again found nothing but carved walls and empty water. The sense of being watched intensified. I felt eyes on me, though I knew I was alone in this abandoned place. My training told me these were warning signs, the beginning of nitrogen narcosis or oxygen toxicity despite my equipment's safeguards. I needed to surface soon. I took final photographs of the platform and the complete temple interior, making sure I had documented everything for later analysis. Whatever I'd discovered here deserved years of proper study by a full archaeological team. My solo exploration had barely scratched the surface of this place's mysteries. As I prepared to leave, I looked up one last time at that central ceiling panel with its massive carved eye. For a disorienting moment, I could have sworn the pupil had moved to track my position. I blinked, and it was just stone again, as motionless as it had been for centuries. I swam toward the entrance, passing between those disturbing guardian statues. Their tentacled forms seemed more menacing now that I understood what they represented. I paused for one final look at the temple interior, committing the scene to memory. My depth gauge showed I'd been down for 3 hours already. It was time to return to the surface and process what I'd found. I turned and swam back toward the city streets, leaving the temple and its dark history behind me. I continued my methodical documentation of the temple, swimming slowly in a spiral pattern to ensure I captured every detail of the carved narrative. The symbols along the floor drew my attention back repeatedly, the same binding patterns depicted in the wall carvings. My camera clicked steadily as I photographed each section, determined to preserve everything for proper analysis later. The water around me began to change. At first, I barely noticed it, a subtle vibration that I attributed to my own movement or perhaps distant ocean currents finally penetrating this unnaturally still place. But the vibration grew more pronounced, becoming a rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from deep beneath the temple floor. I paused, holding perfectly still to verify the sensation wasn't coming from my equipment. The pulsing continued, regular, mechanical, almost like a heartbeat, but too steady, too measured. I checked my dive computer and rebreather controls. All systems showed normal operation with no warnings or malfunctions. The pulse grew stronger. I could feel it against my skin through my wetsuit, vibrating my bones. Each beat seemed to ripple through the water in concentric waves, like someone dropping stones into a pond at perfect intervals. My underwater lights flickered, just a brief dimming at first, then more pronounced flashes that cast dancing shadows across the carved walls. The technical part of my mind suggested power fluctuations from my battery pack, but when I checked, the indicator showed nearly full charge. I turned toward the guardian statues flanking the entrance, planning to exit and check my equipment in the open water. A cold wave of shock hit me. One of the statues wasn't in the same position I remembered. Its tentacled arm extended further, reaching across the doorway. That wasn't possible. Stone doesn't move. I blinked and looked again. The statue stood exactly as before, its stone tentacles frozen in their original positions. I took several deep breaths, forcing myself to stay calm. Extended time at depth could cause perceptual distortions. Every experienced diver knew this. I was simply getting tired. As I moved toward the exit, something made me look back over my shoulder. For a split second, I could have sworn both statues had turned their heads to track my movement. When I spun around fully, they were motionless again, staring straight ahead as they had for centuries. A sound reverberated through the water, low, resonant, oddly musical. It reminded me of whale song, but distorted and wrong somehow, with tones that seemed to overlap and twist around each other in impossible ways. The sound grew louder, then faded, only to return from a different direction. I raised my camera, determined to continue my work despite these strange occurrences. Through the viewfinder, I saw something that made me pull back sharply. Shadowy figures swimming just outside my light's reach, humanoid but wrong in their proportions, with elongated limbs that moved too fluidly for human joints. I looked up from the camera. Nothing was there, just empty water and carved stone. I checked the viewfinder again. The shadows remained, circling just beyond the temple entrance, watching. I took several photos in quick succession, hoping to capture whatever was causing these images. My breathing had become rapid and shallow despite my years of training. I forced myself to slow down, to take measured breaths. Hyperventilation at depth was dangerous, even with a rebreather system. The rational part of my mind still functioned, reminding me of protocols and safety procedures. The water temperature dropped suddenly. My suit's built-in thermometer showed a 10-degree decrease in less than a minute, a change that defied normal oceanic thermodynamics. My heater kicked in automatically, struggling to maintain safe body temperature. The pulsing vibration intensified until I could hear it as well as feel it, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate with the temple's architecture. The floor beneath me trembled with each pulse, sending up small clouds of silt that had lain undisturbed for centuries. I turned in a slow circle, photographing everything. Whatever was happening, I needed evidence. Without documentation, this would be just another tale of underwater hallucination, dismissed by colleagues who'd never believe what I was experiencing. The carvings on the walls seemed to ripple with the pulses, the stone flowing like liquid before solidifying again. The central eye on the ceiling, that massive, watching eye, blinked slowly, its pupil contracting and expanding in rhythm with the vibrations. I told myself none of this was real. Stone doesn't move, carvings don't animate. This was nitrogen narcosis or some other diving complication affecting my perception. Something massive moved at the edge of my vision, a shape so large my brain initially refused to process it. I turned slowly, fighting the urge to spin around in panic. At the very limit of my light's reach, tentacles the size of tree trunks undulated in the water. They moved with deliberate purpose, feeling their way through the city streets toward the temple. The camera slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, dangling from its wrist strap. This was beyond scientific explanation, beyond rational thought. What I was seeing matched exactly the entity depicted in the carvings, the creature the ancient civilization had imprisoned beneath their city. And it was awake. My training finally surrendered to instinct. I needed to surface. Now. I kicked hard, swimming for the temple entrance, past those guardian statues that now seemed less like warnings and more like prison guards failing at their duty. My lights swept wildly across the carved walls as I fled, illuminating scenes of destruction and tentacles dragging people into the depths, images that felt abruptly prophetic rather than historical. The pulsing grew stronger as I swam through the city streets, heading for the open water beyond. The buildings seemed different now, the angles wrong, the proportions distorted. Streets that had been straight now curved and doubled back on themselves. I fought rising panic, trying to remember the way I'd come. The whale song sound returned, louder now, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It resolved into something that might have been words in a language too alien for human vocal cords to produce. My skin crawled as I realized the sound wasn't coming through the water. It was inside my head. I finally spotted the large opening in the outer wall where I'd first entered the city. I swam toward it with desperate speed, pushing my body beyond normal limits. Behind me, those massive tentacles reached between buildings, probing and searching. The water grew thicker, more resistant, as if trying to hold me back. Each stroke required more effort than the last. The strange figures I'd seen in my camera viewfinder now appeared directly in my vision, swimming alongside me, reaching out with two long fingers that passed through my body like smoke. I burst through the opening in the wall, out into what should have been open ocean. The ascent loomed above me, 70 feet of water between me and the surface, between me and safety. I looked up and nearly lost what remained of my composure. The city's spires reached upward from the seafloor like grasping fingers, taller than they had any right to be, stretching toward the distant surface. What had appeared to be a confined city now seemed to extend in all directions, far larger than the island above could possibly support. I swam upward with everything I had, my muscles burning with the effort. The ascent felt endless. I watched my depth gauge with frantic attention. 60 feet, 50, 40, the numbers decreasing too slowly. My lights began to fail, dimming and flickering more severely. The darkness closed in around me, broken only by brief flashes that revealed glimpses of things moving in the gloom, massive shapes circling beneath me, reaching upward as I fled. The pulsing vibration followed me, growing stronger rather than weaker with distance. My dive computer began flashing warnings about my ascent rate. Too fast, risking decompression sickness, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. Whatever waited below was infinitely worse than the bends. At 20 feet, my primary light failed completely. I switched to my backup, a small emergency light that cast only a weak glow around me. The surface gleamed above, tantalizingly close, yet still too far. 10 feet. My lungs burned despite the rebreather providing oxygen. The water pressure seemed to increase rather than decrease, crushing inward as if trying to prevent my escape. 5 feet. Something brushed against my fins, a touch so light it might have been seaweed, except for the deliberate way it wrapped around my ankle. I kicked violently, breaking free. I breached the surface with a splash, gasping and choking despite my regulator. I tore the mouthpiece away, gulping air as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. My boat floated nearby, exactly where I'd left it, though it seemed impossible that only a few hours had passed since I descended. The emergency systems on my dive suit beeped loudly, warning lights flashing on my wrist display. My heart rate exceeded safe levels, and my core temperature had dropped despite the heater. The stress monitoring system had triggered its alarm protocol, designed to alert divers to potential panic situations. I floated on the surface, trying to control my breathing, trying to process what I'd experienced. The boat was only 20 yards away, but my limbs felt leaden, unable to respond to my commands to swim. I forced myself to move, one stroke at a time, fighting the irrational certainty that something would grab me from below at any moment. The water around me remained calm, showing no evidence of the vibrations or disturbances I'd felt below. The afternoon sun sparkled on the surface, a painful contrast to the darkness I'd just escaped. I looked back toward the island. That jagged black rock still jutted from the ocean exactly as before, revealing nothing of what lay beneath. With trembling arms, I pulled myself up the ladder onto my boat. My diving gear, which I'd worn comfortably for thousands of hours across my career, now felt like a prison. I struggled out of it, fingers clumsy with cold and fear as I unfastened straps and disconnected hoses. I sat on the deck, soaking wet and shivering despite the tropical heat. My camera hung at my wrist, the evidence it contained suddenly the most important thing in my possession. If what I'd seen was real, those photographs would prove it. If I'd hallucinated everything, they would show only empty ruins and stone that never moved. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. I hauled myself onto my boat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the ladder rungs. Water streamed from my wetsuit as I collapsed onto the deck, gasping for air that didn't seem to fill my lungs properly. The afternoon sun hit my skin, but instead of warmth, it felt cold and distant, as if I was viewing it through thick glass. My wet hands slipped and fumbled as I tore at my gear, desperate to free myself from everything that had kept me connected to what lay beneath. The regulator, the tanks, the weight belt. I yanked them off and tossed them aside with none of the care I normally showed my equipment. Each piece made a dull thud against the deck, the sound strangely muted like my ears were still underwater. "Get away," I muttered to myself, crawling toward the controls. "Just get away from here." 20 years of deep-sea exploration had taught me to respect the ocean, to move with measured caution. But those 20 years had never shown me anything like what waited in the darkness below this island. Scientific curiosity had abandoned me completely, replaced by a primal need to put distance between myself and this place. My hands left wet prints on the ignition key as I twisted it. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life, the vibration traveling through the deck plates and into my bones. The familiar sound grounded me momentarily in reality. I needed to raise anchor. Moving on autopilot, I went to the bow and began working the winch, pulling up the chain that connected me to the seafloor. The metal links came up dripping, foot by foot, seeming heavier than when I'd dropped it. As I worked, I noticed the water around the boat. It had been calm when I surfaced, but now it moved in strange patterns, churning and swirling without any wind to drive it. The surface broke in small, localized eddies that didn't match any current pattern I recognized. Dark shapes moved beneath my boat, long, sinuous forms that cut through the water with deliberate purpose. They were too big to be fish, too fluid in their movements to be sharks or cetaceans. I froze, the anchor chain cold and wet in my hands as one of the shapes passed directly under the hull. The water rippled as something massive rose toward the surface, then sank again just before breaking through. My breath caught in my chest as I realized what I was seeing, what I'd seen in those temple carvings. I abandoned the anchor. The chain could stay where it was. I stumbled back to the controls and pushed the throttle forward, desperate to move away. The engine whined as the propeller bit into the water, but the boat barely inched forward. Something was wrong. We should have been moving faster. I pushed the throttle all the way to full power, and the engine screamed in protest. My boat strained against an invisible force, as if caught in a current running counter to my escape. The bow dipped and rose, fighting to break free, but we remained nearly stationary. "Come on," I pleaded, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. "Come on." I looked toward the black island with its jagged rocks and saw something impossible happening. The sky above it darkened as clouds formed out of clear blue, swirling into existence like ink dropped in water. They spread outward, blotting out the sun with unnatural speed until a dome of darkness hung over the area. Lightning forked from the clouds, striking the water around my struggling boat. Each bolt lit up the sea in stark white flashes, illuminating what moved beneath. With each flash, I caught glimpses of massive tentacles breaking the surface. Not animal tentacles, but something that looked almost architectural, like the carved patterns from the temple had risen and taken physical form. A bolt struck close enough to spray water across the deck. In that moment of illumination, I saw the water bulge upward 20 yards from my port side, rising into a shape that could have been a head or merely a wave, but with too many eyes, glowing points of light arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The boat lurched suddenly as something grabbed the hull from below. The deck tilted sharply, and I fell against the controls, my hips slamming painfully into the edge. A grinding noise rose from beneath my feet as whatever had taken hold began to pull. "No!" I screamed, though there was no one to hear me. I gripped the wheel and pushed the engine beyond its safety limits. Black smoke belched from the exhaust as the motor strained against the force holding us. The grinding intensified. Looking over the side, I caught a glimpse of something wrapped around the keel. Not tentacles as I'd expected, but what looked like elongated human hands. Too many of them, with fingers that stretched and flowed like liquid. The boat shuddered violently. Warning lights flashed across my control panel as systems overheated and pressure gauges maxed out. If I kept pushing like this, the engine would blow. But if I stopped, I would join the people in those carvings, dragged into the depths by something ancient and hungry. I held the throttle at maximum, refusing to let go even as the control panel began to smoke. Metal screamed against whatever force held us. My knuckles went white on the wheel as I fought to keep us moving forward. Something snapped beneath the boat with a sound like breaking bones. The deck lurched forward suddenly as we broke free, sending me sprawling across the controls. The engine roared as we surged ahead, finally moving at full speed away from the island. I scrambled back to my feet and grabbed the wheel, steering on pure instinct. Behind us, the water where we'd been anchored rose up in a wave that towered impossibly high, a wall of water that shouldn't exist without a tsunami or storm surge. The wave crashed down with a sound like mountains collapsing. Water sprayed high into the air, visible even from the distance I'd managed to put between us. If we'd still been there, my boat would have been crushed instantly. I didn't slow down. I kept the throttle open, pushing the engine well past its design limits. Every part of me focused on a single goal: distance. more distance between me and that place. The smoke from the engine grew thicker, but I couldn't bring myself to ease back. Only when the temperature gauge reached critical levels did I finally reduce power, allowing the overtaxed motor to cool before it failed completely. Even then, I maintained our course directly away from the island, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. The dark clouds remained visible on the horizon, a black smudge against the otherwise blue sky. I kept watching that spot as I navigated, waiting for some new horror to emerge and pursue us. 5 minutes passed, 10. The engine temperature dropped back to safer levels. My breathing slowed from panicked gasps to merely rapid. I allowed myself to look back more carefully, trying to judge how far we'd come. I blinked, looked again, rubbed my eyes and stared harder at the horizon. The island was gone. I turned in a complete circle, scanning in every direction. Nothing but empty ocean stretched to the horizon. No black rocks, no jagged peaks, no dark clouds, just blue water meeting blue sky in an unbroken line. "That's not possible," I whispered. I checked my navigation system. According to the GPS, we were exactly where we should be based on our course and speed. The screen showed no landmass in the area we just fled, not even a submerged shoal. I pulled out my charts and spread them across the console with trembling hands. According to every official map, no island existed at those coordinates. The navigational notes showed only open ocean with deep water. If not for my soaked diving gear scattered across the deck and the water still dripping from my body, I might have thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. But the evidence was there. The samples in my collection bag, the camera hanging from my wrist with its photographic proof, the equipment readings on my dive computer, and the terrible knowledge of what waited below. I set a course for Port Louis, though I had no idea what I would tell the fishermen who had warned me away. Their superstitious gestures and fearful warnings now seemed less like primitive ignorance and more like hard-earned wisdom. As the sun began to set, I rigged the boat for night sailing and prepared for a long journey back. The coordinates on my GPS kept changing in ways that didn't match my speed or direction. One moment we were where we should be. The next, the numbers showed positions hundreds of miles away, sometimes over land that clearly wasn't there. The rational part of my mind, the scientist who had spent decades studying the measurable, the explainable, struggled to process what had happened. But the woman who had seen ancient stone guardians turn their heads, who had felt the water pulse with the heartbeat of something impossibly old, knew that some truths existed beyond the reach of science. I checked my camera, dreading what the images might show but needing confirmation that I hadn't lost my mind. The preview screen remained blank, the battery indicator showing full charge but no images appearing when I pressed the review button. I kept sailing as darkness fell, unwilling to stop even as exhaustion pulled at my limbs. The stars emerged overhead, their patterns familiar and comforting in their mathematical precision. I focused on them, on their reliable light, as my boat cut through waters that might or might not be what they seemed. I kept the boat's motor running through the night, pushing forward on nothing but adrenaline and fear. By dawn, my eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Not yet. Not until I'd put more ocean between me and whatever lay behind me. As the sun broke over the horizon, I finally eased back on the throttle. My fuel gauge dipped dangerously low after running at high speed all night. I needed to conserve what remained if I wanted any chance of reaching land. The ocean stretched empty in all directions, no sign of the shipping lanes that should have crossed this region. I checked my GPS again, blinking hard at the readout. According to the coordinates, I was sailing straight through the middle of Madagascar. I tapped the screen, thinking it must be malfunctioning, but the numbers only jumped to a new impossible location, now apparently somewhere in the middle of mainland Africa. "That can't be right," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange after hours of silence. The boat drifted as I dug out my paper charts and compass. The compass needle spun lazily, never settling on north. I tried to calculate my position based on the previous day's coordinates and my heading, but without reliable instruments, it was little more than guesswork. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since before the dive. In the storage compartment under the deck, I found my emergency rations, packets of dried food, protein bars, and several gallons of fresh water. I'd packed enough for a week, not expecting to need them on what should have been a simple research expedition. I forced myself to eat slowly, to sip water rather than gulp it. Who knew how long I'd be out here? The shipping lanes in this part of the Indian Ocean should have been busy, but so far, I'd seen no sign of other vessels. After eating, exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. I needed to sleep, but the thought of closing my eyes filled me with dread. What if something happened while I was unconscious? What if those things from below found me again? I compromised by setting my watch alarm for 30 minutes and lying down on the deck where I could feel the sun on my face. Just a short rest, I told myself. Just enough to keep functioning. When I woke, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. I checked my watch in panic. I'd slept for 4 hours, not 30 minutes. The alarm must have sounded while I was too deeply asleep to hear it. I sat up quickly, scanning the horizon in all directions. Still nothing but empty ocean. I climbed to my feet, muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard deck. My boat drifted gently on calm seas, the engine silent. I hadn't left it running while I slept. I couldn't afford to waste the fuel. But now I felt exposed and vulnerable in the stillness. The day passed slowly. I tried the radio every hour, broadcasting distress calls on all emergency frequencies. Only static answered me. My GPS continued to show impossible positions, jumping from location to location with no logic or pattern. Sometimes it placed me in the middle of continents, other times in the deep Pacific, thousands of miles from where I should have been. As night fell again, I rationed my food and water carefully. I had enough for perhaps 5 days if I was careful. After that, I pushed the thought away. Someone would find me before then. They had to. I kept all my running lights on, hoping to attract attention from any passing ships. The darkness felt heavier than it should have, pressing in around my small circle of light. I wrapped myself in a thermal blanket against the night chill and tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually won. My dreams were filled with carved stone that moved when I wasn't looking and dark water that whispered in human voices. The second day dawned with a heavy fog that limited visibility to a few yards beyond my boat. The air felt thick and wet against my skin as I checked my dwindling supplies and tried the radio again. This time, instead of static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices spoke through the white noise, rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like language. Not English, not any language I recognized from my travels, but definitely speech, with consonants too complex for human tongues and vowels that seemed to overlap and twist around each other. I dropped the radio handset as if it had burned me. The voices continued for several seconds, then faded back to static. Just interference, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Just atmospheric conditions or another frequency bleeding through. But I didn't pick up the handset again. The fog lingered all morning, turning my world into a small island of deck surrounded by white nothingness. Around midday, something large passed by my boat, creating a wake that rocked me gently. I ran to the railing, peering into the mist, but saw nothing. It happened again an hour later, a large form moving through the water nearby, invisible in the fog but undeniably there. A whale perhaps, or a pod of dolphins. I told myself this explanation made sense, that marine life was common in these waters. Then I heard the song. It rose from the water around me, a haunting melody that started like whale song but shifted into something else entirely. The notes formed patterns that my brain kept trying to translate into words. It wasn't animal vocalization, it was speech, or something trying to approximate speech, with the cadence and rhythm of human conversation. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. If it was whales, they couldn't understand me. And if it wasn't whales? The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt expectant, as if something waited for me to continue. I backed away from the railing, moving to the center of my boat where I could watch all sides at once. The fog began to thin in the afternoon heat, visibility gradually extending to maybe 50 yards around me. Just enough to see dark shapes moving through the water at the edge of my vision, forms too large for dolphins, too sinuous for whales. As evening approached, the fog dispersed completely, revealing an empty ocean turned golden by the setting sun. I watched the water carefully, but the shapes had disappeared with the mist. Perhaps they had only been tricks of light and shadow, my exhausted mind finding patterns in randomness. I ate another careful portion of my supplies and settled in for the second night. The stars came out, brilliant and clear in the pollution-free sky above the open ocean. I tried to find comfort in their familiar patterns, in the knowledge that they at least remained constant. Something flashed in the water below, a brief pulse of blue-green light. My first thought was bioluminescence, perhaps a bloom of dinoflagellates disturbed by my boat's movement. But as I watched, more lights appeared, steady rather than flashing, and distinctly artificial in their arrangement. They formed patterns too regular for natural phenomena, straight lines and right angles, like windows in buildings, illuminated from within and visible through clear water. The lights extended outward in all directions, suggesting structures of impossible size beneath my boat. I grabbed my backup flashlight and shone it over the side, trying to see below the surface. The beam penetrated only a few feet before the water swallowed it, revealing nothing but darkness. Yet the lights continued to glow below, as if existing in some layer of reality my flashlight couldn't reach. I backed away from the railing again, retreating to the small cabin where I could lock the door. Rational explanations failed me completely now. Whatever I was seeing wasn't natural, wasn't possible according to any scientific understanding I possessed. The radio crackled to life on its own, making me jump. Those same strange voices emerged from the speaker, louder now, more insistent. The static cleared momentarily, and for just a few seconds, I heard what sounded like English words mixed among the alien syllables. Surface, coming to, prison, broken. Then nothing but static again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with my back against the door, watching as the lights below my boat moved in slow patterns until dawn finally broke. The third morning arrived with clear skies and calm seas. My water supply had dwindled to 2 bottles, my food to a handful of protein bars. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but thirst would become the real danger soon. I needed rescue, and I needed it today. I stood on my deck, scanning the horizon methodically, quadrant by quadrant. Nothing but blue in all directions. My radio had remained silent since those strange transmissions in the night. I tried broadcasting again, but doubted anyone could hear me. As the sun climbed higher, heat beat down on the deck. I retreated to the scant shade of the cabin, conserving energy and sipping water sparingly. My thoughts drifted to the island. The impossible island that didn't exist on any chart yet had been solid enough beneath my feet. I thought of the submerged city with its massive stone buildings and carved guardians that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Had I truly seen those things? Or was Captain Anderson right? Was I suffering from dehydration, my mind creating phantoms? No. The evidence had been real. The photographs. I picked up my camera again, pressing buttons in desperate hope that it might work now. The screen remained dark despite the battery indicator showing full charge. Whatever had happened in that underwater city had affected my equipment in ways I couldn't explain. Around midday, something on the horizon caught my eye, a dark smudge against the blue sky. I grabbed my binoculars, hands shaking as I focused on the distant shape. A ship, a large cargo vessel moving steadily in my direction. "Please see me," I whispered, scrambling to get my flare gun from the emergency kit. I fired a red star into the clear sky, then another, watching through the binoculars for any change in the ship's course. For heart-stopping minutes, it continued on its original heading. Then, slowly, it began to turn toward me. They'd seen my flares. They were coming. Relief made my knees weak. I fired a third flare just to be certain, then prepared my boat for rescue. I gathered my dive computer, the samples I'd collected, my camera, all the evidence of what had happened. Whatever these sailors thought when they found me, I had proof. Proof that would validate the warnings of the Port Louis fishermen and explain what lived beneath the waves. The ship grew larger as it approached, its bulk impressive against the empty horizon. A Maersk Challenger was painted on its side in large white letters. A standard container ship, the kind that carried goods across the world's oceans every day. Nothing special or unusual about it, and that very normality felt like a lifeline back to the rational world I'd left behind. The ship slowed as it neared my position, coming alongside my small boat with careful precision. Crew members appeared at the railing, high above me, looking down with expressions I couldn't quite read from this distance. A voice called down through a bullhorn, "Ahoy there! Are you in distress?" "Yes," I shouted up, waving my arms. "I've been lost for 3 days. My navigation equipment is malfunctioning." A rope ladder unfurled down the ship's side, dangling just within reach of my boat. A life ring followed, attached to a separate line. "Can you climb?" the voice called. "Yes," I answered, gathering my small bag of evidence. I secured it across my chest, then reached for the ladder. The climb was difficult with my exhausted muscles, but fear of being left behind gave me strength I didn't know I still had. Hands reached for me as I neared the top, pulling me over the railing onto the solid deck of the cargo ship. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," I gasped, looking up at the circle of faces surrounding me. Men in work clothes and safety vests stared back with mixtures of concern and curiosity. One stepped forward, older than the others, with a salt and pepper beard and the bearing of someone used to command. "I'm Captain Robert Anderson. You're safe now. Can you tell us what happened?" A crewman handed me a bottle of water, which I drank gratefully before answering. "My name is Maya Patterson. I'm a marine researcher. I was investigating an island southeast of Madagascar when my equipment failed. I've been drifting for 3 days." Captain Anderson's expression changed subtly. "An island? There are no islands in these coordinates." "There was," I insisted, fumbling with my bag to get my evidence. "I have samples, photographs. There was an island with ruins, an underwater city beneath it." The circle of sailors exchanged glances. Their expressions shifted from concern to something else, wariness, discomfort, even fear in some faces. "You're dehydrated and exhausted," Anderson said firmly. "Hallucinations are common in such conditions. Johnson, take Dr. Patterson to the mess hall. Get her some food." "But I'm not hallucinating," I protested as a young crewman helped me to my feet. "I know what I saw. The locals in Port Louis warned me about it. They called it the prison. There's something there, something ancient that they've known about for generations." The captain's face hardened. "There is no island in these waters. Check any chart, any satellite image. Nothing but open ocean for hundreds of miles. Now, I suggest you rest and recover before you say anything else that might make my crew uncomfortable." I looked around at the sailors. Several had taken subtle steps back from me. One man, older, with skin darkened by years of sun, made a quick gesture with his hand. 3 fingers spread, then curled inward toward the palm. The exact gesture I'd seen the Port Louis fishermen make when I mentioned the island. "You know," I said quietly, looking directly at that sailor, "you all know it's real." The man dropped his gaze, refusing to meet my eyes. "That's enough," Anderson said sharply. "Johnson, take her below now." The young crewman guided me away from the group, his grip on my arm firm but not unkind. As we walked toward a hatchway, I looked back over my shoulder at the captain. He was speaking quietly to his first mate, his expression grim. "They don't like to talk about it," Johnson murmured as we descended a steel staircase. "Bad luck, they say." "But they know it exists," I pressed. "The island, the thing beneath it. They know." Johnson shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm new on this route. I just know the old-timers avoid certain coordinates, even if it means burning extra fuel." He pushed open a door to the mess hall. "Sit, I'll get you something to eat." The food was simple, canned soup and bread, but it was the best meal I'd ever tasted after days of emergency rations. As I ate, more crew members passed through the mess, each giving me curious glances but none stopping to talk. When I finished eating, Johnson returned. "Captain says we'll reach Madagascar in 2 days. From there, you can arrange transport home." "Thank you," I said. "Can I speak with the captain again? I need him to understand what I found." Johnson hesitated. "He's busy with navigation. Maybe later." I knew what that meant. Captain Anderson had no intention of discussing the island again. Later that evening, I stood at the ship's railing, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The ocean stretched empty in all directions, showing no trace of the island or the lights I'd seen beneath the waves. Had it all truly happened? The samples in my bag said yes, but the camera remained stubbornly blank, refusing to show the photographic evidence I'd captured. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of feet. I turned to find an older crewman, the same one who had made the protective gesture earlier. "You really went there?" he asked quietly, his voice heavily accented. "To the place the old fishermen call the prison?" I nodded. "I did. I saw what was beneath it." He glanced nervously over his shoulder, then made the 3-fingered gesture again. "My grandfather was a fisherman in Port Louis. He told stories about something ancient that sleeps under the waves, something that should never wake up. It's awake now," I said softly. I think it might have escaped." The sailor's weathered face paled. Without another word, he turned and hurried away, making the gesture repeatedly as he went. I turned back to the darkening ocean, remembering those massive tentacles reaching through the underwater city streets, the way the stone guardians had seemed to move, the pulsing vibration that felt like a heartbeat. The island had vanished completely after my escape, showing on no charts and appearing in no GPS coordinates. But that didn't mean it was gone. Perhaps it had only moved, relocating to some other part of the ocean where new victims might stumble upon it. Or perhaps what had been imprisoned there for centuries was now free to roam the depths, no longer bound to one location. I stared at the empty water as night fell, wondering what moved in the darkness below. The carvings in the temple had told a story of imprisonment, a binding ritual performed by an ancient civilization to contain something they once worshipped but grew to fear. Had I somehow broken that prison when I entered the temple? Had my presence, my documentation, my mere observation been enough to disturb something that should have remained forgotten? The water looked so normal, so harmless in the fading light. But I knew better now. I knew what secrets it could hide, what impossible things could exist in its depths. And I wondered what would happen when whatever escaped the prison decided to make itself known to the world above.